Imagine you're walking through an African forest nearly 10 million years ago. You're hungry, very hungry. After hours of searching, you finally discover something incredible. A pile of ripe fruit lying beneath a giant tree. Some of the fruit looks perfectly fresh. Some has already split open. Tiny bubbles cling to the sweet juice. The smell is strange, sweeter than usual, almost irresistible. You take a bite. The fruit tastes surprisingly rich, a little warm, almost sparkling. A few minutes later, something feels different. Your body relaxes. Your movements become slightly slower. The world seems just a little less dangerous. You don't know it yet, but you've just consumed alcohol. Not beer, not wine, not whiskey, just fruit. Naturally fermented by tiny microorganisms that have been living on Earth for billions of years. And here's the astonishing part. This may not have been unusual at all. Long before humans built cities, long before agriculture, long before anyone invented brewing, our ancestors may already have been eating naturally fermented fruit on a regular basis, which raises a fascinating question. Who really taught humans to drink? Was alcohol one of civilization's greatest inventions, or was it simply another ancient gift from nature, waiting millions of years to be rediscovered? Today, we're traveling back through evolutionary time to uncover the forgotten story of alcohol. We'll discover why fermentation exists in nature, why monkeys, elephants, birds, and even insects sometimes consume alcohol, why scientists believe our ancestors evolved to recognize ethanol, and why the modern human brain still reacts so strongly to something that first appeared long before our own species existed. Because the history of alcohol is actually the history of evolution itself. To understand how humans started drinking, we have to begin somewhere surprisingly familiar. Not inside a brewery, not inside a vineyard, but beneath a fruit tree. Every year, millions of pieces of fruit fall to the ground before any animal manages to eat them. At first, nothing unusual happens, but within hours, tiny yeast floating through the air begin landing on the fruit's sugary surface. To the naked eye, the fruit still looks almost identical. Inside, an invisible chemical factory has just started working. The yeast consumes sugar and release two completely different substances, carbon dioxide and ethanol. The alcohol we know today, this process is called fermentation, and it is one of the oldest biological reactions on Earth. It existed hundreds of millions of years before humans appeared. In fact, yeast evolved fermentation as a survival strategy. Whenever oxygen became scarce, they switched from efficient respiration to fermentation, producing alcohol as a waste product. Humans didn't invent alcohol. Yeast did. Nature has been quietly making alcohol for an unimaginably long time. Every tropical forest, every orchard, every rainforest, every place where sweet fruit falls onto warm ground has been producing small amounts of ethanol for millions of years, which means something remarkable. The very first alcoholic drink wasn't poured into a cup. It wasn't stored inside a barrel. It wasn't brewed by ancient farmers. It simply fell from a tree, and our ancestors almost certainly found it there. For a very long time, scientists assumed our attraction to alcohol was simply an accident, a strange side effect of civilization. After all, beer has only existed for a few thousand years. Human evolution has lasted for millions. The numbers didn't seem to fit. Then, an evolutionary biologist named Robert Dudley asked an unusual question. What if our ancestors didn't develop a taste for alcohol after civilization? What if they evolved that attraction long before civilization even existed? His idea eventually became known as the Drunken monkey hypothesis. Despite the playful name, the hypothesis is based on a surprisingly simple observation. Imagine you're a fruit-eating primate living in a tropical forest. Every day, finding enough calories determines whether you survive. Some fruit is still green. Some has already spoiled. But perfectly ripe fruit gives off a very particular smell. One of those smells is ethanol. As fruit ripens, tiny amounts of alcohol begin forming naturally. The sweeter the fruit, the more fermentation can occur. That means a faint scent of ethanol may actually signal something valuable. Energy, sugar, calories. Exactly what a hungry primate needs. If an individual became slightly better at detecting that smell. It might consistently find riper fruit than its competitors, more calories, more energy, more surviving offspring. Generation after generation, natural selection could slowly favor individuals who responded positively to tiny amounts of ethanol, not because alcohol itself was useful, but because it helped locate nutritious food. Notice something important. The hypothesis does not claim our ancestors were wandering through forests looking to get drunk. Quite the opposite. Naturally, fermented fruit usually contains only very small amounts of alcohol, enough to produce a recognizable smell, not enough to resemble modern alcoholic drinks. What mattered wasn't intoxication, it was information. The smell acted like a biological clue, a shortcut toward valuable food. And that idea becomes even more interesting when we look beyond humans. Many animals willingly eat naturally fermented fruit. Chimpanzees, orangutans, spider monkeys, fruit bats, hornbills, parrots. Even elephants have been observed consuming fermented fruit under certain natural conditions. Sometimes, they appear slightly less coordinated afterward. Although many popular stories exaggerate these events, scientists remain careful. Most wild animals probably avoid consuming enough alcohol to become heavily intoxicated, because losing coordination in nature can be deadly. A slow monkey becomes an easy meal. A distracted bird misses predators. An unsteady elephant risks injury. Evolution rewards survival, not reckless behavior. So why eat fermented fruit at all? Because the nutritional reward often outweighs the small biological cost, especially if the alcohol concentration remains low. This is where the hypothesis becomes fascinating. Instead of asking, why do humans like alcohol? It asks, why would evolution make fruit smell appealing in the first place? And suddenly, alcohol stops looking like a strange modern invention. Instead, it becomes another ancient environmental signal, one that our ancestors may have been reading for millions of years. But there's an important detail. The drunken monkey hypothesis is exactly that, a hypothesis. It is supported by laboratory studies, genetic evidence, comparative biology, and observations of fruit-eating animals. However, scientists continue debating how large its role really was during human evolution. Some researchers believe it explains a significant part of our attraction to alcohol. Others think the story is more complicated, with many evolutionary pressures acting together. That's how science works. Good ideas are tested, questioned, improved, sometimes challenged, and the discussion continues. Even so, whether the hypothesis eventually proves completely correct, partly correct, or only explains part of the story, it reveals something remarkable. Alcohol wasn't waiting inside breweries. It was already hiding inside forests, long before humans ever learned how to make it ourselves. If alcohol already existed in nature, then why did humans ever bother inventing beer? The answer is surprisingly simple. For almost all of human history, people didn't need to make alcohol. Nature was already making it for them. Imagine walking through a tropical forest after several days of hot weather. The air feels heavy. The ground is covered with fallen fruit. Some has only just dropped. Others have been lying there for days. Tiny cracks have opened across their skins. Sweet juice slowly leaks onto the forest floor. Yeast immediately gets to work. Within hours, fermentation begins. By the next day, the fruit smells completely different. Our ancestors didn't need chemistry to recognize this. They simply noticed. Some fruit smelled sweeter. Some attracted insects. Some attracted animals. Some tasted different. Generation after generation, humans learned which fruits were safe, which were spoiled, and which had entered this strange middle stage, where fermentation had quietly begun. Fruit wasn't the only source. Honey could ferment. Tree sap could ferment. Palm nectar could ferment. Flower nectar could ferment. Even rainwater, trapped inside hollow trees, sometimes mixed with sugar-rich plant material, creating tiny amounts of naturally fermented liquid. Long before breweries, nature had already built thousands of miniature fermentation laboratories. Every warm forest, every tropical valley, every fruit-rich ecosystem repeated the same experiment, day after day. For millions of years, this meant something extraordinary. Early humans probably encountered alcohol many hundreds, perhaps even thousands, of times during a single lifetime. Not because they searched for it, but because fermentation was simply part of the environment. Most of these naturally fermented foods contained only small amounts of ethanol, far weaker than modern beer, far weaker than wine. Certainly nowhere near distilled spirits. They were food first, alcohol second. And that distinction matters. The goal wasn't intoxication. The goal was eating. Alcohol simply came along for the ride. This also explains something many people never think about. Fermentation isn't rare. It's everywhere. Bread rises because of yeast. Yogurt forms through microbial fermentation. Cheese depends on fermentation. Kimchi, sauerkraut, soy sauce, chocolate, coffee. Even some of the foods we enjoy today owe their existence to microorganisms transforming raw ingredients. Humans didn't invent fermentation. We gradually learned how to guide processes that nature had already perfected. Beer belongs to that same story. It wasn't the beginning. It was the next chapter. For hundreds of thousands of years, alcohol appeared unpredictably. A fallen fruit here, a patch of fermented berries there, a little honey left inside a hollow tree. Nothing consistent, nothing reliable. Then something changed forever. Humans stopped following food and started growing it. Agriculture transformed almost every part of human life, including alcohol. Because once people learned to cultivate grains, store harvests, and control water, they accidentally created something nature had never offered before: a dependable supply of fermentable sugar. For the first time in history, alcohol no longer depended on chance. Humans could make it whenever they wanted. And that's when the story of alcohol changed forever. Over generations, accidents slowly became techniques. Techniques became traditions. Traditions became culture. Some of the earliest archaeological evidence for intentionally fermented beverages comes from several ancient civilizations. Residues discovered inside pottery from northern China suggest people were producing fermented drinks thousands of years before written history. These beverages were probably complex mixtures: rice, honey, fruit, sometimes multiple ingredients together. In the ancient Near East, barley became one of the foundations of early beer. In the Caucasus and surrounding regions, people gradually learned how fermented grapes could become wine. Meanwhile, honey continued producing mead, one of humanity's oldest intentionally fermented drinks. Notice something remarkable. These civilizations developed independently. Different languages, different climates, different crops, different religions. Yet many eventually discovered fermentation. Why? Because once humans learned to store food, fermentation became almost inevitable. The ingredients varied. The microorganisms stayed the same. Yeast had been waiting all along. Humans simply created better opportunities for it to work. Alcohol was no longer an accident of nature. It became a predictable product of civilization. And that changed everything. Communities now had beverages for celebrations, religious ceremonies, trade, politics, hospitality, daily life. In many societies, beer wasn't viewed as luxury. It was simply another food, often safer than contaminated water, because boiling and fermentation could reduce certain harmful microorganisms. Exactly how important this was varied greatly across different places and different periods. History is never identical everywhere, but one pattern appears again and again. As civilizations grew, alcohol became woven into culture, not because humans suddenly evolved new brains. Those brains were already ancient. Instead, civilization had finally learned how to provide something evolution had encountered only occasionally: reliable alcohol, available again and again and again. But that created a brand new evolutionary situation. Our brains evolved in a world where ethanol appeared only in small amounts, hidden inside seasonal fruit. Now, entire villages could produce it. Entire kingdoms could trade it. Entire civilizations could celebrate with it. Evolution hadn't prepared the human brain for abundance. And that brings us to perhaps the biggest mystery of all. Why does alcohol affect the human brain so powerfully in the first place? The answer is hidden inside billions of tiny neurons, working silently inside your head right now. Imagine taking a single sip of beer, or wine, or mead. Within seconds, absolutely nothing seems to happen. The drink is still traveling through your digestive system, You feel completely normal, but inside your body, millions of molecules have already begun an extraordinary journey. Unlike most nutrients, alcohol doesn't need to be broken down very much before entering the bloodstream. Its molecules are remarkably small and surprisingly mobile. Within minutes, ethanol begins spreading throughout almost every organ in your body. Your liver will eventually work hard to remove it. But before that happens, some of those tiny molecules reach the most complicated organ evolution has ever produced, the human brain. And that's where the real story begins. Unlike nicotine, alcohol doesn't act by attaching to one specific receptor. Instead, it influences several different communication systems at once. Imagine the brain as a gigantic city. Nearly 100 billion neurons constantly send messages to one another. Every thought, every memory, every emotion, every movement exists because these neurons communicate using tiny chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. Alcohol quietly changes those conversations. One of its strongest effects involves a neurotransmitter called GABA. GABA acts like the brain's braking system. Whenever neurons become too active, GABA helps slow them down. It prevents the brain from becoming overwhelmed. When alcohol enhances GABA signaling, those brakes become stronger. Neural activity begins slowing. Thoughts become less racing. Muscles relax. Anxiety often decreases. This is one reason many people initially describe alcohol as relaxing. But that's only half the story. Alcohol also reduces the activity of another neurotransmitter called glutamate. If GABA is the brake, glutamate is the accelerator. It helps neurons excite one another, supports learning, memory, attention, problem solving. When alcohol suppresses glutamate, communication across the brain becomes less efficient. Reaction time slows. Judgment changes. Decision-making becomes less accurate. Complex thinking becomes harder. This explains something nearly everyone has observed. People under the influence often become more confident, precisely when their ability to evaluate situations is becoming less reliable. The brain feels more certain, while actually processing information less accurately. Evolution never designed this system for modern drinking. It evolved for survival. Alcohol simply happens to interfere with the machinery. Then comes another familiar chemical, dopamine. Contrary to popular belief, dopamine isn't simply the pleasure molecule. Its real job is much more interesting. It helps the brain learn which experiences are worth repeating. Finding food, escaping danger, building social relationships, solving problems. These experiences can activate reward pathways. Alcohol can also increase dopamine activity within parts of that same network. Not because evolution wanted humans to drink, but because alcohol happens to influence systems that already existed. It's a biological coincidence with enormous consequences, and no two brains respond exactly the same way. Genetics matter. Body size matters. Age matters. Food matters. Drinking speed matters. Previous experience matters. Even stress levels can influence how alcohol affects someone. That's why scientists avoid simple explanations. Human biology is rarely simple. There's another fascinating detail. Your brain constantly tries to maintain balance. Whenever alcohol repeatedly changes neural activity, the brain begins adapting. It adjusts receptor sensitivity, changes neurotransmitter production, reorganizes communication patterns. These adaptations help explain why repeated drinking can gradually change how alcohol feels over time. Not because alcohol itself changed, but because the brain responded exactly as evolution taught it to. The brain is always adapting. That's one of its greatest strengths. Sometimes, that same strength also creates new challenges. And perhaps nowhere is that more visible than in humanity's long relationship with alcohol. But if alcohol changes the brain, why did nearly every civilization continue drinking it anyway? The answer has less to do with chemistry, and much more to do with culture. Imagine a small farming village 6,000 years ago. Harvest season has finally ended. Months of exhausting work are over. Families gather together. Food is plentiful. Children are laughing. Music fills the evening air. Someone brings out a fermented drink prepared months earlier. Nobody is drinking because they discovered dopamine. Nobody understands neurotransmitters. Nobody has ever heard the word ethanol. They're drinking because this moment matters. Throughout history, alcohol became attached to some of life's most important events: harvest festivals, religious ceremonies, weddings, peace agreements, trade negotiations, victories, funerals, birth celebrations. Across thousands of cultures, alcohol became less than a beverage. It became a social signal. Sharing a drink often communicated trust, hospitality, friendship, belonging. Sometimes refusing to drink carried its own social meaning. Not because alcohol itself was sacred, but because the ritual surrounding it had become meaningful. Anthropologists have documented remarkable diversity in how different societies used alcohol. Some cultures consumed it only during important ceremonies. Some reserved it for elders. Some allowed only certain types of beverages. Others discouraged alcohol almost entirely. There has never been one universal human drinking culture. Instead, human societies continuously shaped alcohol according to their own values. Religion influenced it. Economics influenced it. Climate influenced it. Politics influenced it. Tradition influenced it. Culture changed the rules. Biology stayed largely the same. This creates what evolutionary scientists sometimes call an evolutionary mismatch. For millions of years, our ancestors encountered only tiny amounts of naturally occurring alcohol, usually inside ripe fruit, occasionally inside fermented honey, rarely in high concentrations. Then civilization arrived. Agriculture increased production. Trade expanded availability. Technology improved fermentation. Later, distillation produced alcohol concentrations that nature almost never creates on its own. Evolution had built a brain for scarcity. Civilization created abundance. The two were never perfectly matched. This idea appears throughout modern life. Our ancestors evolved to seek sugar because calories were rare. Today, sugar is everywhere. They evolved to conserve energy because food was unpredictable. Today, many people spend hours sitting still. The same evolutionary systems that once improved survival can become challenges inside completely different environments. Alcohol belongs to that larger story. It isn't evidence that evolution failed. It's evidence that civilization changed far more quickly than biology could keep pace. Human evolution operates across hundreds of thousands of years. Culture can transform within generations. Technology can transform within decades. Our brains, marvels of ancient evolution, now navigate environments unlike anything our ancestors ever experienced. And yet, despite all the changes, the story still begins beneath a fruit tree, with a piece of ripe fruit, tiny invisible yeast, and one curious ancestor willing to take another bite. Perhaps that's the most fascinating lesson of all. Beer wasn't the beginning. Wine wasn't the beginning. Civilization wasn't even the beginning. Long before breweries, long before vineyards, long before written history, nature had already been quietly making alcohol. Humans simply became another species curious enough to discover it. The next time you see ripe fruit lying beneath a tree, remember, you're looking at one of the oldest chemical reactions on Earth, one that existed long before humans, long before civilization, and one that still connects us to millions of years of evolutionary history. Because the history of alcohol was never really about drinking. It was about curiosity, adaptation, and humanity's extraordinary ability to discover the hidden possibilities already waiting inside the natural world. If you enjoyed this journey through human evolution, subscribe to Sketching Humanity for more stories where archaeology, anthropology, neuroscience, and evolution come together to explain the ordinary things we rarely stop to question. And here's one final question to leave you with. If our ancestors had never tasted that first naturally fermented fruit, would human history have unfolded the same way?